Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. were two very important figures in the civil rights movement. Malcolm X believed that violent protests were the best way to fight this issue in America. On the other hand, Martin Luther King Jr. believed that peaceful protests were a better solution to racism in America because it would not scare people. He thought that violent protests would not be a good way to convince people to change how they thought about African American people. Martin Luther King Jr. wanted to make racist people in America understand what African Americans were going through. Even though the civil rights movement happened in the 1960s, racism is still in American society today. There are often weekly stories on the news about racial protests and shootings that occur between African Americans and white people. One of the more popular news stories is between a white police officer and an African American teen. More often than not, the teenager is not doing anything wrong, and the police officer's racial views get in the way of them doing their job correctly. In many stories, the white police officer shoots the African American teenager, which results in protests that are very violent. There was one protest in Missouri that became violent, and the people of that town started to burn down their buildings. Although racism today is not as noticeable as it was in the 1960s, it is still prevalent in today's society. Sadly, not everyone has the same point of view of equality in America. Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr.'s methods in approaching the civil rights movement both had major effects in attempting to change racism in America through different ideas. This image was published in the University of Kentucky yearbook in 1993. Malcolm X was most likely giving a speech and talking about the civil rights movement. The movie that helped get people talking about Malcolm X as a black leader was the movie called Malcolm X, directed by Spike Lee. This movie had a budget of about $34 million and was a tribute to Malcolm X and all that he achieved and left behind. Because this picture of Malcolm X is on the cover of a magazine or newspaper, it shows the audience that he had a big impact on America's society in the 1960s. This image helps explain how Malcolm X's protests were effective during the civil rights movement. It gives background information about the effect Malcolm X had on America as a civil rights leader. Many people took his opinion on racism seriously, so this movie most likely affected how Americans viewed racism in their own country. Malcolm X was always in the news during this time because his ways of fighting racism were so controversial.
Here is my interview with Khalil Baker from the Black Student Union at the University of Kentucky. First question, do you know who Malcolm X and Martin Luther King are?
Yes. Expert on either of them. So I just have information.
Which jumps right into our second question. Do you believe in violent protest or peaceful protest?
I believe in peaceful protest, but when you say violent protest, what are you talking about? Are you talking about the white supremacists that run over people with their cars, or that come beating up people with bats and stuff? Or are you talking about the Black Lives Matter folks that defend themselves when they're attacked? Because that's what gets painted as a violent protest as opposed to the other. Look at our president.
There's a sub-question to that. Have you ever participated in a protest?
Yeah.
Any?
Plenty.
What protest here?
Not here recently. My first job out of college, I was a organizer, a community organizer around social justice and social change. So I've been part of protests, all different kinds of protests.
And were they effective? Did you get the goal accomplished?
No, the reality. But I'm a pessimist or a realist is probably a better way to say it. I mean, the systemic issues that exist in our country will continue to exist as long as they're upheld by the system that's created them and benefits from them. So as long as we're trying to protest from outside of that system, the system, power does not concede power. And that's just been the reality of the American way.
Now, to jump back to our third and final question about Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., based on your knowledge of them both, who do you think was more effective in the civil rights movement?
It's hard to say that, because when you look at you take, for instance, I think the biggest thing that Dr. King was credited for or associated with is the March on Washington. March on Washington wasn't Dr. King's idea. He didn't lead that. That was co-opted by the powers that be that put Dr. King in place to keep it the way they wanted to contain that. So when you talk about effectiveness, it's hard to measure that. But even still, the things that did come out of the civil rights movement, a lot of that were just small pieces that were conceded for the sake of, I feel, for the sake of maintaining power and oppression in larger, greater ways. So I don't think our country, when you talk about the things that they were trying to do, when you talk about the two movements that both of the men led, we haven't made any great changes. You have things that don't happen as open as they used to, because that's not politically correct and somewhat not accepted. But we're not in this great place that there's been any significant change, I feel, as far as what both men wanted to accomplish.
In the Smithsonian Magazine, there's an article written by Cornel West that talks about Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. and how their styles of approaching the civil rights movement were so different and how these approaches affected America. In the article, it says, quote, Malcolm's love for black people was so strong and so intense that early it led him to call white folks devils, end quote. Malcolm X was very passionate about fighting America's racism issues. He was not afraid to voice his opinion and tell people how he felt. Malcolm X often used violence in his protests to show people how he felt.
This picture was taken in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963 by Charles Moore. The people that are in this picture are high school students who partook in a peaceful protest in support of the Birmingham campaign. Also known as Project C, this movement was the start of protest against segregation. Protests were met with violence even though they followed Dr. King's nonviolent approach. Although Dr. King and his followers did these protests nonviolently, they would be met with violent attacks from white citizens and even police. This included protesters being sprayed by fire hoses, attacked by police dogs, beaten, and etc. Many pictures were taken during the civil rights movement. It was pictures like these that couldn't be ignored. These disturbing images are another factor that helped aid in the fight for racial equality. This image supports Malcolm X's idea of using self-defense in the face of violence. Martin Luther King Jr.'s approach of peaceful protest worked frequently, but did not work in all situations, as demonstrated in this picture.
In an article written by August Nimps, he talks about Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr.'s methods of nonviolence and violence. The article starts out discussing the reconstruction of the African American struggles and how America is fixing them. The article also has passages from the letter of Birmingham jail, which provide a great amount of information that I can use to describe Martin Luther King Jr. along with his nonviolent methods. The letter from Birmingham jail, by the article means, quote, is basically a defense of the right of the oppressed to protest by nonviolent means, end quote. When Martin Luther King Jr. wrote his letter from Birmingham jail, he wrote, quote, you speak of our activity in Birmingham as extreme. At first, I was rather disappointed that my fellow clergymen would see my nonviolent efforts as those of an extremist. I began thinking about the fact that I stand in the middle of two opposing forces in the Negro community, end quote. MLK Jr. realized that he was an important figure and that he was going to need to take both sides of this issue into consideration. This photograph shows Martin Luther King Jr. standing atop the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. He is waving to a crowd of over 250,000 people standing around the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C. These people followed MLK Jr. for a rally that was about freedom and jobs. This was called the March on Washington. The March on Washington and this picture both took place on August 28, 1963. In this image, Martin Luther King Jr. was giving his I Have a Dream speech, which made a huge mark on the civil rights movement. In this speech, Martin Luther King Jr. talked about how he wanted to see America improve. A famous quote from this speech is, I have a dream that my 4 children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Thousands of people traveled to Washington, D.C. to hear his famous speech. It represented Martin Luther King Jr.'s values of love and human dignity. He wanted people to love thy neighbor and believe that everyone should be treated equally.
Hi, this is Daniel Jones, and I'm here with Samuel Hess, a fellow UK student who's a very strong supporter of Black Lives Matters. So, Sam, when considering the civil rights movement, do you know who Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. are?
Yeah, they were both really big activists that really helped each other to get their point across and really help unite our country.
Okay. So, when thinking about these two and their methods of approaching the civil rights movement, whose do you agree with more?
Agree with more. I'd have to say Dr. King's, just because, he was all about the nonviolent protesting, peaceful protesting, and, when you're in big groups like that and big protests, when things get violent, that's when people stop listening. That's when they stop trying to find something they can agree on, and they stop trying to talk things out with their words. Everything just gets violent and hateful, and that's something Dr. King was really against. And you see all these videos and stuff of Dr. King and his followers, and they're getting beat up on and abused and mistreated, but they're always standing their ground, and that has to be something really hard to do. That's something I couldn't imagine having to do.
Okay. So I know you agree with the nonviolent approach of Dr. King, but when thinking about these two methods, whose do you think was more effective in the civil rights movement?
If I had to go with effective, I'm still going to stay with Dr. King. While I still agree, I think Malcolm and his policies were still needed. By any means necessary, I still think that was a big part of their whole movement. They moved separately, but still all for the same cause. I think it still helped to get the point across, but peaceful protesting I still think was the more effective way.
Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. both had two very different ways of approaching racism. Even though they were so different, they were both equally effective in trying to change racism in America through different ideas.